4 years?
Breath of the Wild is my favorite game, but I don't think it's perfect. I'm going to discuss the problems I have with the current melee combat system, and then I will propose a new system that I think would work better in Breath of the Wild or in the sequel. Zelda is designed to be played by children as well as adults, so the new system should be able to be used by anyone, but the current system is so simple that I think we can afford to make it a little more complicated. Combat in video games is often just as much about the enemies as it is about the player. In 3D Zelda games, the two important types of enemies are those with tools similar to the player, and those that are large and imposing. Choo-choos, Octoroks, and Keese don't qualify as important. The enemies with similar tools to Link include Bokoblins, Moblins, Lizalfos, and Mini-Guardians. We'll call this one the Duel. Breath of the Wild's combat is built around this sort of encounter, as the weapons these enemies drop are a major, if not the primary method for the player to accumulate weapons throughout their adventure. Additionally, they are extremely common throughout the overworld, with Moblins, Bokoblins, and Lizalfos making up the vast majority of encounters in the game. The L targeting system at the center of Zelda combat is also designed for enemies the same size as Link, as it often becomes difficult to see Link at large distances caused by targeting large enemies. The new system will focus on this sort of combat as well. The large, imposing enemies in the game include the Hinox, Talus, Guardians, Lynels, the 4 dungeon bosses, and both Ganon stages. We'll call this one the Hunt. Maybe for the first couple encounters you're the one being hunted, but once you know what you're doing, you become the hunter. As Breath of the Wild includes both hunts and duels, it's important that the combat system works well with both. The Breath of the Wild hunts work pretty well with the combat system as is, but the hunt enemies are unfortunately designed in a way that counters its goals. The new system I propose has to work with both the encounters I mentioned, have a satisfying level of complexity, and test the right skills. Let's examine how previous Zelda games test the standard melee combat skills, being technique, reaction time, observation, creativity, and adaptation. All previous Zelda games fall short in roughly the same categories, as Zelda games have always been about puzzles at their core, and that design extends into combat. Combat acts as a puzzle, as the player must observe their enemy, find a weakness, and strike at the right time. This system is at its best when you're facing a new enemy for the first time, since you actively have to observe and adapt to the new situation. But once you learn how to defeat the enemy in question, it's like being given the same simple puzzle you've already solved and asking you to do it over and over, with the only difference being how quickly you can solve it. While this sort of system does a great job testing observation, adaptation, and reaction time, it doesn't test technique or creativity, since it boils down to wait for an opening and attack at the right time. This system is too simple to be fun, and can make the player feel as though they aren't winning the encounters, but the enemies are letting them win. The enemies are invincible when they don't expose their weakness, so the only reason you can ever land a hit is when they directly allow you to. Additionally, if you have your shield up, you can almost never be hit by the enemy you're targeting, which makes the observation too safe and removes urgency from combat. Each game has its own simple directional combo system for regular attacks, as well as a few others such as the jump slash or crouch stab, but the uses of these different attacks in each game overlap with each other too much. There is often little advantage to using different moves, making the choice between them meaningless. Even in Twilight Princess, the secret moves technically give the player more options in the form of new attacks, but these options are not very functionally diverse, as they don't give Link anything he didn't already have. The game also can't assume that you have any of these optional moves, so all the fights have to be built on the assumption that the player doesn't have any of them, meaning that they are never directly applicable. The reaction prompts of Wind Waker are satisfying to pull off the first few times, but they rely entirely on the actions of the enemy and force the player to wait for the right kind of attack before being allowed to perform one. Even Skyward Sword's directional attacks are useless beyond the novelty of one-to-one sword movement, as there is no combo system that takes into account the previous swings you've made, and you're generally forced to swing in the exact direction that the enemy allows you to, so there is no creativity. The most common opinion I hear is that the secret moves of Twilight Princess should be added back into Breath of the Wild, as seen by the top comments on Monster Maze's video. This solution is not as great as it seems, as it means that Link is still left with an incomplete moveset that you have to complete by finding the extra moves. It would be much better to give Link many options from the start of the game, instead of forcing the player to unlock them to have fun with combat. If you think that starting with all the moves wouldn't be fun, then maybe the moves aren't that great after all, and they are only fun because you have to earn them. Breath of the Wild's combat is better than all previous games solely due to the addition of multiple weapon types. While the combined depth of all three types outweighs previous games, each type on its own is of similar complexity to Ocarina of Time or Wind Waker. Breath of the Wild's dual combat accidentally encourages almost exclusively one of two specific strategies. At the beginning of the game, a player can fight offensively if they want, and this helps them learn how attacks work, or they can fight defensively, which helps them learn how enemies fight, or they can go somewhere in between. If the combat system were better, this choice would persist later into the game, allowing for different playstyles to to emerge and be perfected by different people. Unfortunately, as the player progresses, they will likely be subconsciously encouraged to fight extremely defensively or extremely offensively, with almost no variation in between. There are technically plenty of different playstyles that players use to approach combat situations, since Link has so many tools at his disposal. You can use stealth, launch items, drop metal objects, shoot arrows, use bullet time, freeze them, electrocute, frontal assault, distraction, and so on and so on. While Breath of the Wild offers a massive number of options with the many systems that complement the melee combat, that melee combat is what remains underdeveloped. Imagine yourself playing the game with Link in an open field with a single armed black bokoblin in it that has already noticed you. All you have in your inventory are an unbreaking sword and shield, no armor, only 3 hearts, and no runes. How do you approach the fight? The first of the 2 strategies that you are likely to use is the hyper-aggressive strategy, where the player will approach all encounters by swinging the weapon as quickly and as often as possible. This works pretty well, as the enemy will often get stun-locked by any combo and ragdolled by the finishing hit before they can attack, and the player can just follow them and start attacking before they get up and repeat the process. If the enemy has a shield, the player attacks the shield until the enemy's guard is broken before attacking them again until they ragdoll, then restarting the cycle. This strategy is common in new players and in single enemy encounters, but becomes less common in more experienced players that have dealt with many battles with large groups of enemies. The second strategy is the reactionary approach, where the player never strikes first, but waits for the enemy to attack before reacting with a flurry rush, parry, or dodge followed by a regular attack. This strategy is much more common at higher levels of play, short of glitch abuse and speedrunning sort of combat. There are a few mechanics and design choices that seem to accidentally contribute to this bias, such as the flurry rush. While it may be difficult to get the hang of it first, players who know about it and actively trying to learn it will quickly find themselves mastering it. This is because the area in which it can be used relative to attacks and the timing window for activating it are both huge. Often the player can be completely out of range of an attack and perform a jump seemingly way too early or way too late and still be able to initiate a flurry rush. Additionally, since you have to dodge out of the way of an attack to initiate it, even if you miss the timing, you are still moving out of the way and will most likely not get hit. These moves from the Lionel are notoriously difficult to flurry rush, but I personally never feel the need to actually learn the timing since I never get hit by them anyways. Once you master the flurry rush, you can tear through any enemies that you know the attacks of without really putting yourself in any danger. Maybe this is an ideal reward for some people to commend their mastery of the technique, but in my opinion, it's too easy to master to merit such a massive award, and it is a single option that covers nearly every attack, which removes any strategy or thought the combat system might have had. While these problems could be reduced if it was more difficult to initiate, it would still be too powerful of an option. It might also be acceptable if there was a larger variety of enemies that were interspersed to prevent the player from fighting the same enemy type over and over until they know every attack they have in a single hour, but the only real solution is to remove it entirely. Unfortunately, there is a heavy price to removing the flurry rush. My theory is that this move was added to the game very early on, as almost every single dual enemy attack in the game is built around its existence, with the flurry rush being the correct solution for dealing with attacks in almost all cases. Every dual enemy in the game will only attack horizontally or vertically to indicate which direction the player should dodge to flurry rush, and many attacks cover such a wide area that the only way to avoid getting hit is to flurry rush. Moblins in particular have wide horizontal swings, and even hunt enemies such as every Ganon fight except Windblight have attacks that can only be avoided at close range with flurry rushes. Parries are technically equally acceptable reactions to these attacks, but are much more risky and used way less often to the point that these clips likely seem weird. The flurry rush is much lower risk than the parry is, as even with poor, or somehow incorrect timing, the player is unlikely to be hit by any of these attacks. If we remove the flurry rush, many of these moves would have to be reworked or removed to tone them down, as the player would no longer have such a powerful tool for avoiding them. Large sweeping attacks could still exist, but they would have to be reduced in size, so the player's options don't come from the choice to parry or flurry rush, but rather parry or move to avoid. Some of these sweeping attacks should be kept to increase the enemy attack variety, but most should be removed. Removing the flurry rush allows the developers more freedom in how enemies attack, as they wouldn't all have to be horizontal or vertical slashes to ensure Link always has a way out. If we exclusively remove the flurry rush and its associated combat design, the system becomes better, but is still lacking in a few other areas. Defensive players would be forced to attack more often if they wanted to deal damage, but the encounters remain in a sort of wait attack situation. One of the factors that contributes to this is the way that enemies move when they get hit by attacks. They sort of do this bobblehead movement that is a good idea on paper, but in practice, this movement combined with whatever camera angle the player might have, often masks the drawback motion that signals an oncoming attack. This acts as another factor in the combat system that discourages offensive tactics. It makes it difficult to tell if the enemy is going to attack you if you're playing offensively, often discouraging the player from initiating an attack and instead waiting for one of the enemy's openings with their shield up so they can actually see when the enemy is winding up. If this jiggle was greatly reduced, the player wouldn't be withheld any information in the fight, which makes it easier for more strategies to emerge. For example, the player could now be up and in the face of the enemy, constantly attacking until they see them wind up to strike back, where the player would jump back to avoid it without a flurry rush, or perform a quick parry before continuing the onslaught. Another factor contributing to defensive play is enemies with shields. The only way to break their guard once their shield is up is to land a combo finisher hit on the shield, which opens them up to be attacked. Players are discouraged to attack them because doing this damages the player's weapon, and it takes quite a while to finish a combo, making it very risky in group combat, which is the most common place to find enemies with shields. It is also mechanically uninteresting, as all you are doing is mash an attack to open them up so you can, well, mash attack. Breaking guards needs to be done in a different way from dealing damage. In conclusion, Link's defensive toolkit is too strong, and we'll have to account for that and correct it in the new system. The most egregious issues with duels are due to Link's moveset, while the issue with hunts lies with the enemies. So much so that the hunts could be greatly improved without even needing to change a single thing about Link. To see what traits make a good hunt, we'll look at Monster Hunter, as the entire premise of this game is that you fight huge monsters with primarily melee weapons. You can easily draw parallels between it and Breath of the Wild, but there are a few key differences that allow people to play this game for thousands of hours where they just fight the same monsters over and over. One of the common traits between the monsters in this game are that they are all longer and/or wider than they are tall. The monsters are often very fast and tend to move around the battlefield a lot, but a large hitbox allows the player to land hits without needing perfect positioning. The monsters don't always face the player. They turn to them before doing an attack, but stay in the same orientation for a few seconds after their attack, granting the player an opening to land some hits before the next one begins. The long hitboxes also allow the monster to be attacked from any angle. Even more importantly for the gameplay of Monster Hunter is the existence of multiple different hitboxes along the body of the monster, with some of them being weak and some strong. This allows skilled players to plan their positioning and attacks to deal maximum damage with the fewest hits. Long monsters that aren't tall are also better for being seen on a 16:9 screen, as it allows for more of the monster to be on the screen at a time, which makes it easier to predict attacks and plan accordingly. One of the most hated monsters in all of Monster Hunter is the Kirin. This monster is technically longer than it is tall, but it's so small that it's incredibly difficult to hit. Its attacks also have blind spots that are difficult to navigate because of their confusing telegraphs, as well as its attacks often hitting all around it. Another important aspect of Monster Hunter is that it places the player in an attack-evade rhythm. All of this is super well outlined in Patch Quest's video, Why Monster Hunter World's combat is so satisfying, so go watch his video, it has criminally few views. The attack-evade rhythm in Monster Hunter makes the combat system so great as it gives the player control over how the fight plays out by allowing more than one solution to problems. The player can stay back out of the way of incoming attacks and only retaliate when they deem it absolutely safe, or they can play aggressively and stay in the blind spots of the opponent's attacks, always staying in range to counterattack whenever the slightest opening shows itself. The important part about this system is the player always has this choice. No matter what the attack is from the opponent, they can always stay close if they want or always stay far away. Of course, the game doesn't make either strategy easy. It's very difficult to stay in the blind spot of every single attack a monster throws at you for an entire hunt, and monsters will chase you down if you run away from them, but the chances are there if the player is skilled enough to take them. There are some exceptions, like some monsters being able to fly or swim out of reach, but these account for relatively small portions of the fight, and players tend to complain when these actions take up too much time. Monster Hunter has beautifully crafted its hunting in a way that allows for player expression, and even though the fight often appears to be dictated by the monster being hunted, in reality, it is the actions of the player that dictate how the fight goes. The boss combat in past Zelda games follows a different approach, where instead of an evade-attack rhythm, they have an evade-attack sequence. Instead of allowing the player to choose when to attack and when to evade, the game gives you only one option at a time. Bosses have attack patterns where they are completely invulnerable, but they eventually come to an end where an opening is exposed and the player is allowed to land a few hits. The sequence also takes much more time to transition between the two sides, where the attack-evade rhythm allows the player to switch between the two to various degrees constantly throughout the fight, and often every few seconds. The evade-attack sequence often takes a minute or two to transition from evade to attack and back again. While I certainly don't prefer the system over the evade-attack rhythm, it isn't objectively worse. It goes hand in hand with the item progression that is so central to older Zelda games by giving the player a chance to use their new item to defeat a boss. Breath of the Wild should use an attack-evade rhythm when constructing hunt combat encounters, as it is much more in line with the game's emphasis on player freedom. It introduces more variation in strategy than the more traditional evade-attack sequence, in the same way that many other Zelda traditions were reworked to allow more freedom. The problem with boss combat in Breath of the Wild is that it tries to have it both ways. It can't decide between having an attack-evade rhythm and allowing the player more freedom to approach combat how they like, or having an attack-evade sequence where the player attacks when they have to and evades when they have to. Every hunt monster in the game has some design choice that contributes to this split, and the combat is worse off because of it. The common problems that the hunt monsters of Breath of the Wild face are an abundance of area-clearing AoE attacks that railroad the player into specific strategies for defeating them, a laser focus on the player that forces reactionary combat, and frequent blatant weaknesses that eclipse all other options and make the fights too easy. The area of effect clear attack problem is best presented by the Hinox. His hitbox is much taller than it is long or wide, so even though he is quite large, you have to be right next to him to land a hit, much like the Kirin. His butt slam and stomp attack both hit all around his legs and act as clear attacks, and he will do these every time you get close, which forces the player to back off almost immediately every time they get close, also much like the Kirin. Similar attacks can be found with the Stone Talus, Lynels, Water Blight Ganon, Fire Blight Ganon, Calamity Ganon, and Monk Ma's Koshia in his final phases. These clear attacks act as mini antitheses to a proper evade attack rhythm combat system. Players need to have blind spots that are perhaps difficult to stay in, but are there nonetheless, as otherwise the player has no choice on how they react to the situation. All of these clear attacks do not afford the player this option. They have no blind spot, and they are clearly included to force the player to run away from the enemy for their duration. There is only one exception that I can think of, being the spin attack of the club-wielding Lynels, but this is not very widely known, and the player is still unable to traditionally attack the Lynel from this position, making it not very useful to most players. Some of these attacks can be parried or flurry rushed, but not all of them can. I would even argue that the choice to parry or flurry rush these moves is a useless option, as an option to flurry rush overshadows all others, and an option to parry still forces the player to not attack, as they often have to reposition themselves so they can see properly and time the parry. Making the player reposition themselves to stay in the blind spot of an attack before continuing an attack is fine, but if the player has to back up just to look at the enemy and wait for the attack to start in order to parry, then it is functionally equivalent to making the player run out of range of the attack. Repositioning in blind spots can be done before the attack starts if the player sees the windup and correctly predicts where the attack will hit, but waiting for a parry requires the player to wait for the attack to land before it can be avoided, much like running away and waiting for the attack to miss. Essentially, the choice the game gives you between running away or parrying is meaningless, as both options are virtually identical in the player's response. To demonstrate how laser-focused even the final boss is on Link, let's perform a quick experiment. If you had to, could you describe what Ganon's thorax looks like? Here it is. This won't be the first time you've seen it in-game, as you've likely seen it in the intro cutscene and when Ganon climbs on the wall where you probably weren't even looking at it. You almost certainly have never done this and seen it this close. This is quite the shame, as it's a waste of half the entire final boss, and is a major piece of his design that the player might never really get a good look at since Ganon fights the way he does. But more importantly, this forces reactionary combat. Ganon will track your movements during his attack windups, which gives the player no chance to look for blind spots and keep attacking if they are skilled enough, meaning that the only viable strategy is to back up and flurry rush or parry his moves to grant openings. This is only reinforced in Ganon's second phase, where the only way to get hits at all is to parry or flurry rush. If Ganon adopted a focus strategy closer to that of the monsters in Monster Hunter, he would face Link and begin the windup for an attack, but not rotate from that initial position, allowing the player to move around and land hits while Ganon attacked, instead of being forced to react to create openings. He would need to be given more attacks that originated from other angles on his body, so he wouldn't have to keep spinning back to look at Link after every attack, but that could easily be done with his many legs and long extendable arms here. This problem is present with every other hunt enemy in the game as well. Even Thunderblight Ganon, who is often heralded as the best boss fight in the game, is just a glorified test of timing in the most archaic type Zelda boss fight in the game. The blatant weaknesses the monsters in Breath of the Wild display also make the player even more likely to follow a specific strategy, which further kills the freedom this game supposedly offers. Once again, we can use the Hinox as an example. I don't have any issues with his eye being a weak point that can stun him, and I think him covering his eye below half health is awesome, but the player should have more options for approaching the battle. If this fight was in an older Zelda game, the player would be unable to damage the Hinox at all unless they shot him in the eye, and the Hinox would cover his eye most of the time, only letting the player attack at a certain time. That clearly isn't the case, as the player can technically damage the Hinox at any time, but while the player isn't completely forced to shoot the Hinox in the eye before attacking, they are heavily encouraged to do so. The player is railroaded so forcefully into this strategy that I bet I can make most of you incredibly uncomfortable with this footage of me repeatedly shooting him in the stomach. But why does that have to be the case? Why can't I shoot him in the body to do damage? In the same way I could ask, why can't I stay up close and attack his feet the whole time if I'm good enough? His other attacks don't have the same area of effect as the butt slam, but since he follows your movements during their windup, they act in a similar fashion since there is effectively no blind spot. If the butt slam was removed or reduced in frequency, and he stopped following your movements so exactly with his other attacks, the player could choose to stay up close and avoid his attacks to land hits, which would allow for the diversification in combat strategy that this game so desperately needs. I have many more ideas on other exact changes that would improve the fights of every hunt monster in the game, but I've been told that they're too extensive and out of the scope of this video. I could theoretically make a whole other video about that if interest is high. I've spent long enough talking about why the current system could use improvement, and alluding to how mine might be able to solve some of the issues, so now I'll make good on those claims and present my new system. First, as I've stated, the flurry rush gets removed, but the player can still backflip or side hop to avoid attacks. One of the larger changes to the entire system I'd like to see is the addition of another attack button when the weapon is unsheathed. Each weapon type could have a heavy and light attack, each represented by their own button. Unfortunately, this will require a fair bit of button use shuffling, as all 4 face buttons currently have rather important and irreplaceable uses. The best layout I could think of was X as light attack, A as heavy attack, Y as parry, B as jump, and right bumper as the run button. I put X and A as the attack buttons, as some of the moves I present later involve pressing both at the same time, which would be difficult if they are arranged in other fashions. Holding the light attack button would allow the player to throw their weapon, and pressing light attack when holding an object would throw it. As a useful side effect, using the right bumper as the run button would allow the player to change the camera angle while running. I admit that it sucks to change the layout, as many people have countless hours put into Breath of the Wild and would likely need a long time to properly adapt to large changes like this. Ideally, there would be options to customize the layout so everyone can make it work for themselves. Adding another attack button is not as complicated as it seems. Both heavy and light attacks would have their own basic combo that work much the same as the existing basic combo, with light attack having a slightly faster combo and the heavy attack being slightly slower than the existing one. Combos would be very simple and intuitive, as instead of a list of inputs the player would have to learn, at any point in either combo aside from the last hit, the player can switch between heavy and light attack. Switching between the two resets the combo counter, so combos can be strung indefinitely as long as the player switches at the right time. Holding the attack button will no longer perform a charge attack, but pressing both attack buttons at the same time will perform a combo finisher that does extra damage, but leaves Link open for a while afterwards. Heavy and light attacks will be differentiated with a larger gap between attack duration and damage, as well as their animations being distinct, so an onlooker can tell which attack was being used without too much knowledge of the game. For a 2-attack button system to work, another change that has to be made is the removal of the game's stubborn adherence to round number attack multipliers. This includes all attacks doing the same amount of damage from a weapon, unless the player does a 2x multiplier attack, such as throwing the weapon, breaking it, or using a critical hit weapon. Instead of this, different attacks will be multiplied by numbers other than just 1 and 2. While this will make it harder to perfectly count the number of hits to kill something, it's not a huge loss. Light attacks will do 1 times damage, heavy will do something like 2, and pressing both does something like 3 or 4 times more. This isn't too much of a change, but the major multiplier difference would come from the addition of a timing-based attack system that I'll discuss in a minute. To finish this addition, the way durability is calculated would have to change, with each attack doing a certain amount of damage to the weapon proportional to how heavy of an attack it is. This is necessary so we don't accidentally encourage players to use only heavy attacks to do more damage while preserving durability. Essentially, we would aim for heavy and light attacks doing the same amount of damage per durability, so neither is better in that particular regard. In real life, there is an optimal distance for your sword to swing before you turn it around to attack in the other direction. If you turn it around too early, you end up slowing down your strike and not hitting with your full force, and if you turn it around too late, you end up leaving yourself open and don't hit as fast. This part of sword fighting could be represented in Breath of the Wild if the timing with which you press the button determined when Link reverses his strike. This would allow the player to mash the attack button in combat, but it would reduce damage output. Preemptive reversals would do around 75% damage, and if you reverse too late, it would do full damage, but you wouldn't be able to attack as fast and it would be less efficient. This multiplier would increase a little every frame until it reaches 100% at the ideal reversal time, and then it would remain the same past that point. The ideal reversal time would probably only be 1 frame long, but the multipliers for missed timings wouldn't absolutely destroy a player's ability to fight if they weren't perfect. Reversing too late would do the same damage as reversing perfectly, but would be slower. This would raise the skill ceiling, as highly skilled players could do more damage in the same amount of time, even with the same weapon. To take this even further, pressing the heavy attack button very quickly in succession so your second presses before Link even performs the initial swing would perform a feint attack that could bait enemies into dodging or shielding and covering their line of sight. This would also serve to completely disallow mashing heavy attack, as pressing the button too fast would mean that Link would never even swing the weapon. The heavy attack button could be held to make Link prepare to strike, much like the beginning of charge attacks in the current game, to act as a different type of feint. Feints could only be performed with heavy attacks, and light attacks would still allow mashing to the heart's content, just with a reduction of damage output. The reversal system is alright by itself, but it really becomes a full-fledged mechanic when combined with another change to the game. One of the things I find weird about Breath of the Wild is that all weapons in a category swing exactly the same. The Savage Lynel sword is absolutely massive, and Link can swing it at the same speed with which he swings the Garuda scimitar, which is a tiny sword not even a quarter of the size. An interesting mechanic would be that big, heavy weapons would swing more slowly than smaller ones, but would still have the same animations and combos within the same category. Combined with the reversal system, every weapon would have a different reversal timing. This not only adds variety to the combat system, but adds a few important aspects of realism. First, it means that when you pick up a new weapon, it's unfamiliar by default, as it likely weighs different from your other weapons and requires a little getting used to. It also makes all weapons potentially useful for the entire game, as you are likely to get used to a particular weapon and be willing to use it late in the game regardless of its attack, because you're familiar with how it swings. The reversal timing for light and heavy combos from the same weapon would be different as well. This balances the two attack systems' potential for infinite combos, as switching with proper reversal timings may be difficult to master, and players may be inclined to stick with just heavy or just light combos, which would be perfectly acceptable. Players might also mistime the reversals under stressful situations, forcing them to learn how to stay calm even against tough enemies. These changes may make the combat system seem needlessly complicated, but remember you are still fully capable of picking up any weapon and spamming the light attack button to your heart's content, with the only difference being that you would deal less damage than someone who knew how to use the weapon well. The goal of my system isn't to make the game impossible to play casually, just to raise the skill ceiling for skilled players. Another way that I would like to add variety is to increase the number of weapon categories by splitting the existing ones. I find it a little weird that the Boko club swings exactly the same as the Master Sword. This can be addressed by splitting the one-hand weapon category into one-hand cutting weapons, which we'll call arming swords, and one-hand blunt weapons, which we'll call maces. The main difference between these categories is in how they contact enemies. If you hit something with a sword, it would likely cut through it, right? Even if the object is too solid to cut straight through, such as this tree, if you pull the sword across the surface, you would still be able to follow through as if you did. Of course, there are small differences, but we don't need to worry about these for a video game. This is also not always how you're supposed to use cutting weapons, but it's useful to make the distinction in this case. Now on the other hand, if you wanted to damage this same tree with a blunt stick, you could still pull it across as you did with the sword, but with no cutting edge in the stick, it would be basically useless for dealing damage. You would want to hit the tree basically parallel, so the stick would stop upon contact and transfer all its energy to the tree. Your empty swing of both weapons might be superficially similar, but when the weapons make contact with the target, the outcome is rather different. In Breath of the Wild, regardless of if you use the Master Sword or the Boko Club, Link still draws the weapon across the enemy as if the weapon has a blade. This sort of makes sense in terms of game design, as it maintains consistency and makes it easy for the player to pick up any weapon and immediately know how it functions. However, I believe that this is a good opportunity to add some depth to the combat system. Breath of the Wild already partially separates arming swords and maces, as they have slightly different combos and have different effects in some areas. I'm suggesting that they be divided a little more, as in they are separated when sorting the inventory, but more importantly, work differently on contact. When the weapons whiff, they can have more or less the same combos and reversal timings if they have equal weight, but on contact with an enemy or object, the arming sword maintains the same reversal timing while the mace has a different timing offset by about half a beat. This makes maces a little more difficult to use, but this could be compensated by giving them less of a penalty for missed perfect reversals. There's also another reason for this that I will go over later in the video. As for other changes to the categories, since you can carry a shield, both weapon types allow you to parry. Parries will work much the same, but with a few added changes. First, parries can be performed more quickly after any swing in a combo except the last. They can't be performed in the middle of a swing, but a little quicker than the game currently allows. The point of this is to allow skilled players to perform extended combos on enemies, even when they counterattack, as long as the player is skilled with parrying. Additionally, after a parry, if the player presses the light attack button, they perform a regular light attack and can start a combo. But if they press heavy attack, they perform a special parry attack that hits much harder but has a lot of end lag. Finally, not all attacks can be parried anymore. Depending on the weight of the weapon being swung at you and the strength of the enemy holding it, they might hit too hard for Link to parry with his little arm. There could be an armor set, effect, or ability that grants you the ability to parry any attack, but I don't think it should be standard issue. This would prevent the parry from becoming an all-encompassing response to attacks like the Flurry Rush currently is, and forces the developers to ensure many of the large attacks from hunt monsters have blind spots, since parrying is no longer an option for dealing with heavy attacks. The combo finisher attack for both categories would probably just be a standard spin attack. It would also be cool if the game took better advantage of its varied weapon designs and made a few special weapons within each category. For the arming sword, there could be a small assassin knife, sort of like the Garuda scimitar, that would do little damage but would have a much larger multiplier for sneak strikes than other weapons. The same assassin weapon, or maybe a different one, could give Link modified dodges, where Link does an automatic swing during the dodge that can damage enemies. There could be a mace that does massive damage to shields. Two-handed weapons could be split in a similar fashion, with cutting weapons being called longswords and blunt weapons being called clubs. I know this is inaccurate, we just need names to distinguish them. But on top of that, we'll derive two more categories from them. Super large blunt weapons will be placed in a new category called super heavies, and super large cutting weapons will be placed into a category called great swords. I've heard many people complain about two-handed weapons being too slow to use in Breath of the Wild, and these two categories might be able to do a little to counter this. Longswords would be basically as fast as arming swords, but would have more range and hit a little harder, with the downside being that you can't carry a shield. Clubs would be to longswords as maces are to arming swords. That in itself could be enough to justify the different categories, but we can make them a little more interesting. One possibility could be to give both categories stances. There could be high, medium, and low stances that would all have slightly different uses. They could be chosen from by choosing a starting stance from the start menu, or by flicking up or down on the right stick when choosing from the D-pad menu. High stance would make attacks come out quicker and hit a little harder. Mid stance would give the player a weak parry with a sword that can't deflect as heavy of attacks as the shield can, and potentially have a tighter timing to pull off as well. Low stance would give Link quicker movement speed when L targeting, and slightly longer hops and backflips, but with slower startup on attacks. I felt that these categories deserved their own gimmick to separate them from the other categories, but this choice may prove to be too much work for the player to bother. A possible compromise for simplicity's sake is that each weapon is locked into one of these stances, and if you prefer one stance or another, you need to find a weapon that uses it. Longswords would swing through enemies much like arming swords, while clubs would stop upon impact and have different reversal timing. The two would have different heavy and light combos, and the final hits for clubs would have a chance of ragdolling enemies. The combo finisher for longswords could be like the charge jump slash from Twilight Princess, while a combo finisher for clubs could be a big forward moving spin into a downward strike that would cause a small shockwave. There could be a special longsword that fires beams like the Windblade, and there could be a katana-like sword that has a finishing move where you just pull an anime and attack super fast, so when you sheath your weapon, the enemy takes big damage. A special club could be an ancient baseball bat that has a different combo finisher where Link swings it like a baseball bat, and it always ragdolls enemies and sends them flying really far. The Master Sword is treated like an arming sword in the current game, but Link uses it in both hands in cutscenes, which would make it a longsword. We can allow for both by placing it in a category called hand-and-a-half swords, which are defined as arming swords that have handles that are long enough to be capable of being wielded with two hands as well. Other weapons in the game fit this description as well, so the category could contain more than just the Master Sword. The weapons could default to one of these two categories, but the alternate version could be selected by holding the left bumper or something while pressing A while selecting the weapon from the pause screen or the D-pad menu. If used as an arming sword, hand-and-a-half swords would be on the heavier and slower side of the scale, while using them as a longsword would put them on the lighter and faster side. There could also be an equivalent category for blunt weapons. It would also be acceptable to limit this category to just the Master Sword, as it would make it more unique, as well as making it more widely useful to a variety of players. As it is in the current game, if a player greatly preferred spears over the other two weapon types, they might be a little upset to find that the only unbreakable guardian-killing weapon in the game isn't in the category they like the most. This is less of an issue in the current game, as all weapon types are fairly similar, but with the system I'm proposing, it greatly differentiates the weapon categories and would result in possible disappointment from players that dislike arming swords. Greatswords are somewhat similar to longswords, but are considered too large to be able to be swung in the same way. They would obviously have more range and hit harder, but wouldn't have stances or parries, and they would be more useful for fighting large groups of enemies with their large, horizontal swooping attacks. They would have slow startup and end lag, but would balance it with their range. Combos would of course be different from longswords, with a bigger emphasis on wide swings instead of quick strikes. There shouldn't be any chance to ragdoll with any of the cutting weapon categories, but if there had to be some way to do it, it would be with the final hits of heavy combos or combo finishers from greatswords. The combo finisher would probably just be a big spin attack. Special greatswords can include a weapon that allows the current game's charge spin attack, and possibly an ancient weapon that is already a greatsword, but heavy attacks extend the blade even longer for massive range. One of the more common complaints I hear from Breath of the Wild players is that the two-handed weapons are too slow to be fun. The final category is the super heavies, which are the blunt equivalent to greatswords, but I've tried to make them different as well as a little more interesting to use. Super heavies would not just be blunt greatswords. They would have different weak attack combos and reversal timings, but their heavy attack would be where the magic happens. It would have massive startup and end lag, but would allow Link to move slowly while starting and ending the attack, allowing you to weave in and out while charging massive strikes that would hit extremely hard. The heavy attack wouldn't have any reversal timing due to the nature of the attack. The combo would be a spin into an uppercut strike that always sends smaller enemies flying. Special super heavies could include a weapon that creates an explosion when a heavy attack hits the ground or an enemy. There could be a stall moblin arm that is the lightest super heavy, but could grab smaller enemies and hold onto them, making the weapon much heavier and increasing its damage temporarily while also damaging the captured enemy. Holding the light attack button while the enemy is held wouldn't throw the weapon, but would just throw the enemy. Let's make spears a little more interesting than their current one attack state. The weak attack will be a shorter jab where Link keeps both of his hands planted on the spear, and the heavy attack will see Link slide his front hand back to allow him to hit further at the cost of speed. The combo finisher will be a big step through low to high thrust. To balance the huge range advantage of the spear, it would have a permanent hitbox along the length that, when hit by a downward strike from a heavy weapon, such as a super heavy, would break the spear immediately, even if an enemy was holding it. To keep it from being too vulnerable, holding the parry button would make Link pull back the spear closer to him at the cost of increased startup lag on attacks. Special spears can include the already existing halberd, but with a heavy attack replaced with a big slice, short spears that can be held in one hand with a shield in the other, and harpoons that have a rope attached to them that allows you to pull them back after throwing it. Weapons that function differently like this could be indicated by placing a little icon in the corner over the weapon in the pause screen, which would prevent players from being surprised when they work differently. That covers all the melee weapon changes I'd like to see, but I'll go over some other changes that I'd enjoy as well. To complete the transition to an evade attack rhythm in the new game, we'll have to change how much Link can move while attacking. In Breath of the Wild, when you start an attack, Link stops moving and becomes sort of glued in place for its duration. If you mash attack, you have very little control over where Link faces beyond its initial direction as well. When using a two-handed sword, you can change your direction but you still can't move. It would be better to revert to a system more similar to the one used in Twilight Princess, where Link can move around during combos, just not too much. He also can change direction to compensate for poor starting direction and to follow moving enemies, but more importantly, to make small adjustments in the middle of combos to stay and hunt enemy blind spots. This would give developers a little more freedom in their construction of attack animations, as Link wouldn't always have to do these horizontal slashes to ensure you can hit the target in front of you, even if you aren't holding the left trigger. This could be combined with reworking the forward jump while your weapon is unsheathed. There is very little use for the jump attack in Breath of the Wild, as it acts as another mostly useless move option to give the illusion of a diversified moveset, especially in my new system. The forward jump could be replaced with the classic roll that the series is known for, and would be an incredibly useful option for closing distance to remain in blind spots or for crossing up enemies. Bow combat is pretty sweet already, but it would be nice to have a little more variety in bow stats, such as certain types of bows having built-in stat differences in draw time, firing rate, range, precision, and arc shape. It would also be cool to have a harpoon arrow that could be shot into a cliff face with a rope hanging down that could speed up climbing. I also don't think headshots should ragdoll enemies since it gets so thoroughly abused, but it should still do double damage. There could be special arrows that cause ragdolls instead. Shields shouldn't have different weights that affect their parry timing, since it already takes long enough to learn one timing, so making it different for every shield is a good way to scare away most new players from ever learning how to parry. The only change I would make is the addition of a mechanic with wooden shields. If anyone blocks a cutting attack with a wooden shield, the weapon should sometimes get stuck in the shield for a bit. During the time when it's stuck, the person wielding the shield can press the heavy attack button to do a special bind attack that deals extra damage and sends the enemy flying. If the player is the one who gets stuck, they can't move until the weapon is pulled free, but if they unequip their weapon, it stays stuck in the shield and the enemy can either drop the shield or grab the weapon and steal it by breaking the shield off of it. Shields that get stuck like this take lots of damage, and if they break, the wearer staggers for a moment and are open to damage. If the player gets their weapon stuck in the shield of something like a Moblin or Lynel, the enemy could just lift up their arm and sort of throw Link off, doing damage to him. Some weapons, like the chainsaw blade, could be immune to this mechanic and would also do massive damage to wooden shields. The point of this mechanic is mostly to add more depth to shield choice, but it also allows wooden shields to stay relevant later in the game aside from only in thunderstorms. Finally, to fulfill my promise from earlier, I'll talk about breaking enemy guards. In the current system, this can only be done by hitting a blocking enemy's shield with a last hit of a combo or with charge attacks. This isn't a bad thing to keep, but we lose the charge attack methods since holding light attack throws the weapon and holding heavy attack acts as a feint. This still leaves us with the same problem I mentioned earlier, where it takes too long to break guards, and all you do is attack the shield as you would attack the enemy until their guard breaks, and then you just continue to attack. To fix this, we need a faster method of breaking guards that isn't just attacking. I propose that parries should be used as a replacement. This is similar to the shield bash in Twilight Princess, so that's what we'll call it. We don't need a new animation for it, as the current one really conveys a lot of power behind it, and I like it more than the one from Twilight Princess. This solves the problem I mentioned earlier, as it's a different move than attacking and is much quicker to pull off. It also adds some more use to shields and expands Link's moveset without too much effort. This would still damage shields unlike parries, and would quicken the pace of battles, and more importantly, it would place agency in the hands of the player. The player might not always be able to use their shield and weapon at the same time, but they can always sheathe their weapon as they do to parry or block in the current game. That more or less does it for changes to Link's end of the combat system, but there are still some other changes to be made elsewhere. Breath of the Wild's difficulty scaling comes in the form of different colored enemies representing increased health pools. While it's not a bad idea to have higher level enemies have more health, Breath of the Wild places too much emphasis on it. It would be much more interesting if higher level enemies fought smarter rather than just for longer. The enemies already display this on a very basic level, where higher level bokoblins will kick bombs away, do longer combos, drop their weapons less frequently, attack more frequently, and so on. Since we're expanding Link's abilities so much, we'll do the same to his opponents. The enemies could have access to all the abilities and changes I mentioned before, minus parries. This means that they can perform heavy and light attacks, combo finishers, throw their weapons, etc. Red bokoblins could act pretty much the same, as low-level enemies should still be pushovers that teach players how to play, but higher-level enemies should have access to a wide pool of moves and strategies. It would be cool if they could carry more than one weapon that they could pull out if they lost the first one, as well as employing strategies that counter the current weapon type you're using. Gold bokoblins currently have 90 times the health of red bokoblins. If they fought much smarter, this gap could be brought down, as they would already be much harder to kill with an increased moveset. Giving them more health makes them harder to kill, to be sure, but it mostly just turns fights into endurance matches where the player has to go through multiple weapons and spend quite a while just to kill a single bokoblin. If we made higher level enemies much smarter in combat, we could reduce their total health, and it would not only allow skilled players with bad equipment or returning players on new files to defeat them earlier in the game, but it would also allow creative players too scared to face them in direct combat to look for the many other awesome ways Breath of the Wild allows for enemies to be dispatched creatively and indirectly until they become skilled enough to defeat those enemies head-on later in the game. Some examples for how this could be done is to make higher level enemies move around more, use their shields more often, recover from having their guards broken quicker, use feints more often or more erratically, switch weapons during combat, have shorter droughts, have unique attacks, and taunt less often, to name a few. I'm sure many of you have seen Dunkey's video on The Witcher 3, if you haven't you should, and you may recall this part.
Dash, swing, dash, swing.
I didn't really get the joke the first time I watched this video before I played the game, but I'm sure everyone who has played The Witcher 3 understands perfectly. In The Witcher 3, you can cancel your sword swings at any time with a dodge, so the safest strategy is often to dodge back and then take a single swing, cancel with a dodge back, take a single swing, and repeat until you win. Some parallels can be drawn to flurry rushes in Breath of the Wild, as sword swings can be cancelled with jumps at any time to allow players to flurry rush during their own combos, but this can't be done with parries for some reason. Both The Witcher 3 and Breath of the Wild have overpowered strategies in the form of spammable moves, but this has a solution. All that is required is the addition of learning enemies. Stronger enemies should be able to learn your attack and defense patterns if you tend to do the same thing all the time. I mentioned earlier that with the addition of heavy and light attacks, players might have trouble at first switching between the two mid-combo, as it would be much more difficult to get the reversal timing down, so I predicted that new players would generally pick one or the other and sacrifice the chance of an infinite combo for an easier time with reversals granted by the ease of repetition. Enemies that can learn your fighting style would be very effective against players that only use heavy or light combos, as it would be very easy for the game to notice a pattern. This would serve to influence these newer players to improve and get more creative in combat. The learning would be accomplished by the game checking for patterns in your combat style. If you prefer heavy or light attacks, this would be noted, and enemies would attack in your windup or cooldown and get good at blocking your attacks. If you have a signature infinite combo such as light light heavy, and always use it up close and parry incoming attacks, the game would take notice and enemies would start blocking everything and sneaking a quick attack in as you wind up for the heavy part of the combo. If you like to start with feint attacks to trick new enemies and get free attacks, the game would notice, and enemies would start calling your bluff and attacking you as you do the feint instead of blocking. If you constantly try to break guards with shield bashes, the game would notice, and enemies would become resistant to guard breaks as they would hold onto their shields extra hard. Enemies in a new area wouldn't already know how you fight before you get there, but as you fight one guy or a group of guys, they all learn how you fight. This change would solve the problem I mentioned earlier about combat getting stale after enemy patterns are learned. While I do think that learning how an enemy fights and learning to counter it should be possible and is a good reward for putting time into that enemy, I also believe that making every enemy the exact same and completely unable to learn and offer challenge to more experienced players is not ideal. Learning how an enemy fights should grant an advantage to players that decide to learn it, but shouldn't make them invincible. If this change is made, it also makes it more difficult to learn how enemies fight and extends the glorious discovery phase in Breath of the Wild. Yet another advantage of learning enemies is that it acts as a sort of fail-safe for the integrity of the combat system. If enemies like this were introduced into vanilla Breath of the Wild, they would single-handedly fix the overuse of the flurry rush. If players were always just standing around waiting to pull one off, enemies would learn to do feint attacks to bait a flurry rush, then go in for the real attack when the player is in the air. To clarify, even though I think this would solve it, I still think flurry rushes should be removed. The point is, learning enemies would act as amazing buffers to any parts of my system that end up being accidentally too strong. This level of adaptation is too much for bokoblins to be doing, but bokoblins are supposed to be easy enemies anyway, so instead, let's bring in some new enemy types that are capable of higher level fighting ability. For example, the fan favorite Darknut could act as a very skilled opponent for Link, sort of like a Lionel but more up close and personal in its combat strategy. They could do feint attacks, attack from different angles, and use special attacks. We can even let them do parries if we want them to be really scary, but to avoid making them too unsafe to attack out of fear that they could just parry and destroy you, they could only be able to parry when they place their shield in a specific position to tell the player when they should lay off the frontal assault and try something else for a minute. These stronger enemies could also perform shield bashes that break your guard to punish players for playing too defensively and just relying on Link's infinite blocking ability to prevent any damage. A secret boss could be added to the game in the form of Dark Link, who possesses all the abilities of the player and is very difficult to defeat. He could be very quick at learning how the player fights, and can make the duel a battle of who can adapt faster and pull off the most unexpected moves. Not only would Dark Link learn how you fight, but he could start copying which moves you used, and it would make defeating him much like how the fight was portrayed in the Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time manga, where Dark Link could do everything Link had ever done, so Link had to pull off a new move that he had never used in order to win the fight. If we want to get crazy expanding on the concept of learning enemies and possibly push hardware limits, strong enemies could remember how you killed them, and be smarter in dealing with that strategy after they respawn with the Blood Moon. Then, not only would you have to mix up your strategies mid-fight, but you might also need to mix up your strategies when returning to areas that you had previously cleared of enemies. One more universal change I'd like to see is a much reduced emphasis on ragdolling enemies. As I mentioned earlier in the video, ragdolling makes it very easy to completely destroy enemies as long as you're quick enough and understand how to ragdoll in the first place, which isn't too difficult. While ragdolling is busted in one-on-one encounters, I understand that its real purpose is to enable the player to take on large groups of enemies at the same time, where ragdolling some of them temporarily gives you space to take on the others. If we reduce the amount of times Link can ragdoll enemies, it would greatly increase pressure from groups of enemies since Link wouldn't be able to clear them away as easily, and they would be able to attack much more frequently. This would be a good change, as the new weapon categories I mentioned earlier introduce some weapons that are very well suited for group combat, which adds another layer to weapon choice. When Link is swinging around a large weapon like a greatsword, low-level enemies could back away and stay out of range to allow for more one-on-one combat early in the game. In the same vein as ragdolling, burning, freezing, and electrocuting enemies is too abusable. They all completely incapacitate enemies, and often allow for their weapons to be stolen, which makes the fights way too easy. Elemental effects like this should stay in the game, but their effects should be reduced, and they should be made more difficult to apply to enemies. In real life, fighting a group of enemies with something like a sword is very difficult, as splitting your attention to attempt to block attacks from many angles at the same time is next to impossible. While Breath of the Wild does capture this unique feeling a little bit, it's only really at the beginning of the game before the player has a good grasp of the combat system. Later on, when the player has better armor and knows how to deal with groups, they become much less challenging. In this new system, to counter large groups of enemies, Link would be able to wield a weapon from the Greatsword or Super Heavy category with huge sweeping attacks that could ragdoll enemies, unlike the smaller weapons. Since many people are likely to default to arming swords in this new system, much like the current one, this would give some much needed usefulness to larger, slower weapons. If you've watched Joseph Anderson's video, which you should, you'll be familiar with the next two issues I have. First is Link's ability to pause the game at any time and shove 60 apples down his throat with no penalty. This almost makes health completely trivial, as you can never be killed from one hit at full health, and if you do get hit, you can pause, heal, and reset your focus sash. Once again, Monster Hunter has already solved this problem by forcing the player to shift through their menu in real time and heal themselves with a slow animation that leaves them open to further damage. I'm well aware that plenty of other games do something similar, I'm just most familiar with Monster Hunter. This could be accomplished by making the item menu of the game not actually pause events in the background, but more importantly, holding the whistle button could open a sliding menu much like the other buttons on the D-pad that the player can shuffle through in real time in order to select food to eat, and when selected, Link does his little eating animation outside of the menu, leaving him open. The food menu could have limited slots to prevent the player from having to shuffle through 100 slots before finding the food they wish to eat. Alternatively, they could just copy every other game that does this and separate elixirs into their own category and make them the only thing that can be consumed quickly like that. Personally, I just think elixirs should be quicker to consume than food, which would grant them additional use, as currently, they're not really worth making over just meals with the same effects. There could also be special ingredients that, when cooked into a dish, would allow that dish to be eaten in less time and reduce vulnerability. Another game that handles this issue very well is The Witcher 3. If you want to heal in The Witcher, you can press a button to eat your equipped food whenever you want, even during an attack, dodge, using magic, and so on. You can also eat food while the game is paused, but there's a really smart way of making this fair. When you consume food, you get a healing buff applied to you for a limited amount of time. While you have the buff, even if you take damage, you keep healing until it runs out, meaning that you still have to play it safe when you're low on health and trying to heal. In Breath of the Wild, you can immediately heal back to full health and continue the fight as if nothing happened, but in The Witcher, you have to slowly claw your way back up to safety, all while having to avoid further damage. If you eat more food while the buff is already applied, it just replaces the buff from before, meaning that you can't shovel food down your mouth to speed up the healing process. It would also be quite easy to incorporate this into the game, as you would still be allowed to pause and eat food at any time. The only change would be that it takes a minute to get that health back. It would also work very well with the current system, as special ingredients could have the effect of making dishes cooked with them increase the recovery speed. Both Monster Hunter and The Witcher have great solutions to this issue, but if I had to choose one for Breath of the Wild, I'd go with the one from The Witcher, since Link has very strong defensive options, even with my changes, allowing for proper healing while in combat. The Monster Hunter system would be great when doing hunts in Breath of the Wild, but it might make it impossible to heal when fighting the upgraded dual enemies I've proposed. The other issue Mr. Anderson mentioned was the inappropriate damage calculation that uses subtraction as opposed to something more complicated using division. This is the main reason that Breath of the Wild's difficulty curve looks like this, where the early portion of the game is often punishingly difficult and the late game becomes a cakewalk. Once the player acquires armor with enough defense, all attacks will only do a quarter heart of damage, minus a few exceptions, and when combined with a large number of hearts that the player likely has, as well as a massive amount of food and fairies, the player will likely not die for so long that getting killed in the Yiga clan hideout will be rather jarring. With the strongest armor in the game, maybe an unarmed red bokoblin should still only do a quarter heart, but not this Lionel, or this massive rock dropping on me, or literally Ganon. I don't have a calculation to present that would make this work better, as it's probably a little more complicated than I can address and would require some playtesting to finalize, but as long as my idea makes sense to you all, I don't think it will be necessary to propose an exact method. Another change I'd like to see is the reduction of the gap between the attack of the strongest and weakest weapons in the game. This would allow early game weapons to be more viable later in the game, and since weapons would have different reversal timings, players might find that they prefer a specific weapon from early game as they know the reversal timing. It wouldn't remove the weapon progression entirely, as later game weapons would still have higher attack, just not as much as before. It would also pair rather well with my proposed reduction of the health gap between weak and strong enemies. I'm not suggesting that we make a stick as powerful as the Master Sword, just that if the weakest weapon does 2 damage, the strongest weapon does like 50 instead of 108. A large point of contention in Breath of the Wild is the game's durability system. Many people like it how it is, but perhaps a larger portion of the player base wants durability to be increased across the board, or for the system to be removed entirely. Personally, I'm a fan of the system, but I do agree that it is rather flawed as it is. I'll address some of the common solutions I see brought forward and why they wouldn't work. I also have a solution that I think would work, but first, let's go over the issues with the current system so that we can understand why mine would perhaps work better than the others. The primary complaint I seem to hear about this system is that the weapons break too quickly. People find this annoying as it means that the cool weapons you've found don't stick around for too long, making them feel like hollow rewards, as well as constantly forcing the player to pause to choose a new weapon to equip, which can take a significant amount of time, especially late in the game when you have so many weapon slots. The obvious solution here is just to increase durability, but this would actually compound some of the other issues with the system. I'm sure many of you find yourselves keeping high-powered weapons untouched in your inventory since you don't want to waste them. Here's a picture of my inventory in my first run about 50 hours ago, and here's a picture of my inventory in the same file right now. The fact that I have any of the same weapons after 50 hours is absolutely ridiculous if you think about it. As Joseph Anderson stated in his video, this is encouraged by there being no durability marker on your weapons in your inventory aside from a marker for unused weapons, which is one of the things that we'll add. The lack of a marker means that since you don't know when a weapon will break after you start using it, you might as well just keep using that same weapon until it breaks to avoid having half your weapons be almost dead and breaking them all in a row during a single fight, leaving you defenseless. It also makes many players keep an open spot in their inventory to replace the half-broken weapon with whatever they find next. The entire point of the system is to encourage players to use a variety of weapons, but if half the slots in my inventory are reserved for rare and powerful weapons that I never want to use, then there's little point in killing enemies around the map since their drops are insufficient and they respawn, then why would I ever be encouraged to try them? If we increase durability, I get to spend more time using my throwaway weapons and have even fewer chances to break out my powerful backlog, and even if I do, I don't have to use as many of them before the combat encounter is over. Not all players experience this problem, but it needs to be addressed since the majority do. Ideally, the system should encourage everyone to use every weapon in their inventory more or less equal amounts and not make the players feel so attached to the weapons they pick up. On the other end of the scale, people are concerned that you could end up in a situation where all your weapons break against a powerful enemy and you become defenseless. This isn't as much of a problem in my system as it is in the current one, as I've lowered the health of powerful enemies, but mini-bosses or bosses might still have enough health to cause a problem. One solution I've heard for this problem is the addition of other Master Sword-like weapons that can recharge to make sure that you are never empty-handed for long. The issue with this is that it only compounds the hoarding I mentioned earlier. Most of you who got the Master Sword likely found yourselves using it first in all monster encounters, as well as a tool to cut trees and mine ores. Having more of these would only increase this practice, especially combined with the suggested overall increase in durability. If you had more than one with a recharge time of the current Master Sword, you would almost certainly always have at least one charged one. The recharge times would be short enough that by the time you broke the unbroken ones, the first one would be recharged again. If we increase the recharge time, you would only occasionally even get to use the weapons at all. Imagine if it took 30 or 40 minutes for the Master Sword to recharge and how little you would actually get to use it. Another solution I've seen proposed is the addition of an unarmed punch for Link or a weak unbreaking weapon that you get at the beginning of the game. The issue with these is the same that is already caused by the Master Sword. People will always, or at least very frequently, use this move instead of using their rare and powerful weapons. The logical next step would be to make sure it had very little attack to encourage the use of other actual weapons, but by the time you make the attack low enough to discourage using it unless completely necessary, it would be so useless that there would be no point in its addition. If the attack is too low to be useful, then you won't be able to make any dent in any difficult opponent's health. It would only be usable against low-level enemies, and you can bet your bottom dollar that people will use it instead of their other weapons when they fight the low-level enemies. Another issue would be that if you were given this weapon early game, it would invalidate all the other early game weapons and not let players learn how to use the durability system. It would be useful for fighting all the early game enemies, and since it would never break, new players could quite easily get used to only using that weapon, and then have much more trouble getting used to the durability later in the game when it actually starts to matter because the unbreaking weapon becomes too weak to be usable. A third solution I've heard for this problem is to make sure the player can always steal the enemy's weapon and give enemies that don't carry weapons some other way of supplying weapons to the player during a fight. The problem with this is that in the current game, stealing an enemy's weapon essentially ends the fight. An enemy with no weapon poses no threat as they deal way too little damage to cause any trouble. Additionally, the weapon an enemy is carrying is often the reward for defeating them, so being able to easily steal it removes the incentive for the player to even defeat the enemy since they've already collected their reward. There would be nothing stopping the player from just stealing weapons from enemies they encounter and then running away without killing them, as you can do in the current game. Giving all mini-bosses and bosses weapons scaled to their difficulty embedded in them or something for the player to take, ensuring they never run out of weapons to use in a fight sounds good on the surface, but it causes some other problems. First, it causes the Master Sword issue again. If the weapons aren't as good as the player's current weapons, they might be encouraged to take the new weapons from the boss and kill the boss to preserve the ones in their inventory until later. Perhaps more importantly, if every enemy in the game has weapons on them that the player can use to kill them, then weapons used as rewards and shrines and the overworld will no longer have any meaning. The player would have even less incentive than they already do to pick up these weapons, as they know that any enemy they ran into would be carrying something that they could use to kill it. I've also heard that a repair system should be introduced, but this causes the same problems I've been discussing with the other solutions, in addition to forcing the player to travel to a repair location to get their weapons back, wasting more valuable time. It also reinforces to the player that their weapons are important and they should get attached to them. I've worked very hard to make my solution to this problem heavily suggest to players that using their weapons is the best way to play, as it is generally the most fun. My solution to this problem involves a few changes. Most importantly would be the reduction of the possible weapon slots. The maximum could be 10 or less, and you could start with only 3 or 4. There would be an overall increase in durability, but not enough to compensate for the reduced slots, only about a 2x increase. This is with the goal of not allowing players to carry as many busted weapons that they refuse to use and actually force them to use the weapons in their inventory. The increase in durability also fixes the issue of weapons being poor rewards as they last longer, and it reduces the amount of pausing in battle to switch weapons. Weapons should be less common in the overworld, and fewer enemies should use them. I've already suggested that we bring in new enemy types, and this would help to accomplish the reduced number of weapons in the overworld. We could have returning enemy types from previous Zelda games, as well as newly invented ones that don't wield weapons. This could contribute to increasing enemy variety and keeping combat fresh for longer. This is sort of an aside, but with enough additions, we could get cool stuff like area-specific dual enemies other than just elemental variations. Of course, the issue with this is that the enemies would need some sort of other drop that could incentivize players to kill them, since they would no longer supply weapons, but that sort of falls out of my jurisdiction, so we'll just have to assume it's been done. To tie my durability system all together, we complete Breath of the Wild's crafting system and allow the player to create weapons from the drops of enemies that they dispatch. They wouldn't be nearly as powerful as proper weapons forged by real blacksmiths, but would do the trick in a pinch. This could include attaching bokoblin horns to a stick to make a mace, or attaching red choo-choo jelly to a stick to make a torch. These aren't super interesting, but ideally, the new monsters that get added to the game would have parts that are more conducive to impromptu weapon construction. These weapons could possibly be constructed at any time in the inventory, or maybe only at certain crafting benches or anvils, or some other forge that could be found in and around settlements. Maybe flimsy clubs, maces, and super heavies could be constructed anywhere, but metal weapons could only be constructed at forges. The flimsy weapons wouldn't be very powerful or last very long, but would provide a backup if necessary. They could also be more trick-based weapons, so instead of dealing as much damage, they could apply effects such as poison, stunning, freezing, burning, and so on. Another collectible reward the game could incorporate with the addition of a crafting system is blueprints that allow the player to forge new metal weapons throughout the game. These could be tied to side quests and would likely act as better rewards than any of the current ones. The metal weapons that the player could forge in towns would never be quite as good as weapons found in the wild because Link isn't a legendary blacksmith or some other reason, but they would certainly be better than the clubs, maces, and super heavies Link could craft in the field. Since I'm reducing the number of weapons in the overworld and increasing the number of categories, it will potentially take longer for the player to find weapons in a category that they like best, so a crafting system will act as a good fallback for when players get tired of being forced to use categories they don't like as much. As I mentioned earlier, blunt weapons will have different reversal timings from their cutting counterparts that can make them slightly worse, and they become a little more difficult to use. Even if players learn the timing, I also suggested that the penalty for missed reversal timings be reduced to simulate how blunt weapons are generally easier to use in real life. This means that even if skilled players learn the reversal timings of blunt weapons, they still have incentive to go to towns and forge cutting weapons instead of relying on flimsy blunt ones. New players who want maximum damage output are also encouraged to do this, as blunt weapons are more difficult to get perfect reversal timings on. Players who mash instead of trying to get perfect reversal timings have no such incentive, but I imagine that the type of person to not want to spend time to learn a mechanic like this would also not want to spend the time required to go into town just to make better weapons, so I doubt this is an issue. An unrestricted crafting system would likely result in many of the same issues I mentioned before, as a player could easily just leave a slot open in their inventory and make these weapons with their extra materials every time they see a monster to attempt to preserve their precious strong weapons, but there are a few solutions to this. First is that weapons of any kind can only be made at forges or crafting tables that are found in settlements. This is quite similar to how the game currently is, as the player can always just teleport to a stable to grab a new, free, throwaway weapon or something anytime they break one of their current throwaways. The issue here is that the player could still run out of weapons during a fight with a strong enemy if they have very few weapons, which is the whole reason I wanted to add this mechanic in the first place. This would be less common of an occurrence, as strong enemies would have less health in my system, with their difficulty coming from how smart they fight, but it might benefit the design of some enemies to still have lots of health, and it's always a possibility even with lower health enemies as I've made weapons less common. This means that the player needs to be able to craft these anywhere to prevent this situation, but we also need to discourage them from making a new one every time the old one breaks to protect their valuable weapons. I have a couple solutions to this that could work on their own or be combined if necessary. The first is to make the crafting of any of these weapons take up a lot of materials so the players can only do it if deemed absolutely necessary. This isn't the greatest solution as it completely removes the option early in the game, so we can make weaker weapons take fewer materials to craft and the stronger ones you can make, which still wouldn't be too strong, take relatively more, but this leaves the issue unfixed for players that have played the game for a long time and acquired enough materials to make as many weapons as they want, or for material kleptomaniacs. If we make the price so high that this would never happen, it would be at the point where very few people would ever actually get to make these weapons, and it would once again remove the option early game. The weapons shouldn't be too cheap to make, but they need to be accessible to players so they can make them at any point in their playthrough to prevent them from being stuck with no weapons. This solution is pretty weak by itself, but I do think it should be incorporated to some degree to complement the second solution. The second solution is to make these weapons take up more than one slot in the inventory. Since you would only start with 3 or 4 slots in my system and end up with a maximum of 10 or less, it would be unlikely for the player to stockpile these craftable weapons to avoid using their nice ones as they would take up so much inventory space. Additionally, this means that when the player is low on weapons or breaks all their weapons in a fight, they can still make these weapons without any fear of filling their inventory. The only problem with this is that incredibly stubborn players might just leave the required 2 or 3 slots open to keep crafting these weapons every time the previous one breaks, so the second part of this solution solves this. All we have to do is make Link have a mandatory crafting animation outside of the menu for building these weapons, much like the cooking one, but unskippable. This would discourage players from making these unless absolutely necessary, but more importantly, make sure they couldn't just keep crafting new ones in the middle of combat, as enemies would be able to hit them during the animation. The absolutely ultra stubborn players that completely insist on keeping their inventories full of their nice weapons could still theoretically run just out of enemy detection range to make these weapons in safety when the previous one breaks, but we're down to such a tiny minority that I don't think we have to worry too much anymore. This could also make new types of memorable combat moments possible, where the player breaks their last weapon in an important fight and has to somehow find an opening to craft a new weapon in the middle of the fight, possibly creating some incredibly close calls. There will always be someone who tries to game a system like this to avoid wasting consumables, but with the right penalties and limitations, this behavior will become much less common. In the current system, players can still teleport to stables or other cities with free weapons to preserve their nice Royal Guard weapons, but this practice is so uncommon because of the loading times and the break-in pace that I imagine many of you have never thought to do this even after many hours of playing. This just goes to show that it is possible to greatly discourage behavior like this, but impossible to prevent it entirely in a situation like this. Some players will find it more fun to keep their powerful weapons and never use them, and that remains possible in my system, but I've made it much more difficult, as most players would agree that using powerful weapons is fun, but never use them anyway, just in case. It may seem as though I'm dwelling too much on preventing players from abusing this, but it's important to protect players from situations like this, since the durability system was so thoroughly criticized as not being fun, despite players having the option to make it fun for themselves with little effort. This concept is very well outlined in Game Maker's Toolkit's video, How Game Designers Protect Players from Themselves, if you'd like further discussion about this sort of philosophy. The final major change is the reworking of the Spirit Orb system. As it is, you can exchange 4 Spirit Orbs for a Heart Container or a Stamina Vessel, but I think that there should be additional categories that Link can choose from. For example, there could be a Strength category that could increase Link's damage with all weapons by 1 or 2 points per upgrade. There could be a Speed category that increases Link's base movement speed by small increments, a Dexterity category that makes Link swing his weapons slightly faster, and a Defense category that increases his base defense. To compensate for the increased number of choices and potential places to put upgrades, their price could be decreased to 2 or 3 Spirit Orbs per upgrade, to allow for a few more upgrades without having to change the number of shrines. There shouldn't be strict maximums for any of the categories, so the player can min-max Link to their heart's content, with the exception of weapon swing speed and Link's movement speed, as letting those go on forever could cause some issues. With this change, shrines become more immediately useful since it takes less time before you can cash in your orbs. It also adds a level of character customization to further complement different playstyles. These upgrades wouldn't be necessary in the slightest to beat any area of the game. Much like how stamina and hearts are both useful in combat but not required, this would just add more incentive for the player to complete shrines or whatever other objective the game could create to offer these as rewards. The advantage Link would gain from these upgrades would be noticeable, but not so much that it becomes required, such as movement speed increasing by a maximum of 25% or so, and attack by something similar. This change is much less important than the others I mentioned earlier, but I just wanted the Spirit Orb system to potentially have a larger impact on the game's combat and allow for more player freedom in the form of further combat style customization. I've heard it suggested before that an XP system be incorporated into the game to act as an incentive for players to kill enemies other than their drops, but I don't think this is a great idea. Part of what makes Breath of the Wild so great is that the player is free to go anywhere and do anything in any order with very little to stop them. Adding an XP system would likely create more arbitrary barriers where enemies are literally too strong to kill for players early in the game, regardless of their skill, and this is something I'm already trying to remove by reducing the gaps between the strongest and weakest weapons, and making the difference in health between the strongest and weakest enemies less pronounced. If this sort of system was incorporated at the level I'm suggesting Spirit Orb upgrades be changed, it would be useless as the rewards for leveling up would be too minor to encourage players to put time into it. The Spirit Orbs are optional, but an XP system would likely have to be made mandatory, with much harder enemies in some areas to justify its existence, but that would go against the player's freedom to go wherever they like. That covers all the major changes I'd like to see, but there are still some small changes that I think would be cool. I have a friend who said he wanted more use for the Korok Leaf, so it should have an option to be equipped as a shield that has no defense, but when you press the parry button, it creates a wind gust that can still push enemies away. The gust would be weaker than the gust produced by the two-handed Korok Leaf, but would still be able to push enemies back. This allows for it to be used practically in a combat situation along with an actual damaging weapon. Now, the player can push some enemies in a group out of the way to temporarily focus on others, which makes group fights more manageable. Instead of being an option in the menu, more than one type of Korok Leaf could be made, so some are always two-handed weapons while some are always shields, and they could be distinguished by their shape or color. Weapons that aren't axes shouldn't be able to cut down trees. They should instead be caught in place in the tree, much like what I suggested with shields. This would allow the player to use force to their advantage when fighting enemies, as they could bait an enemy to swing next to a tree and get caught before retaliating. Larger enemies with larger weapons could just slice right through the trees instead. Smarter enemies would of course know about this and actively work to avoid it, as well as making sure to hit Link if the player is the one to get stuck. Another change I'd like to see is a little more effort being put into tying the length of the weapon's hitboxes to the size of their models. I've had a few experiences where weapons look like they should connect but don't, or look like they shouldn't but do. Finally, let us customize the HUD more, please. I don't want all my epic pictures to have my low health in the corner. And that's the end of my changes. The last thing I'd like to address is the main criticism that most of you will level against my system, which is that it's too complicated for the many children that play Zelda games. My system seems to fly in the face of this aspect of the franchise, but it's not as much of a problem as most people would imagine. Firstly, many of my changes are less obtrusive than they seem. Players can avoid using both attack buttons and just stick to one. Perfect reversal timings aren't required to win battles, and mashing still absolutely works, just not as well as proper timings. More difficult enemies can be avoided, much like how many players already avoid Lynels and Guardians in the current game. Different weapon types may work differently, but as I've said, you can still mash to get by with any of them, even if you don't completely understand how it works. The most important argument that this new system isn't too complicated is that Breath of the Wild already includes many complicated interactions and systems that younger children are still completely capable of figuring out on their own. There are also plenty of other games that are arguably much more complicated than this that I've seen kids play rather proficiently. My little brother was playing Switch Axe in Monster Hunter 3 Ultimate at about 10 years old and got along just fine, even though it has a much more complicated combat system than what I'm suggesting. Finally, Breath of the Wild is quite a difficult game for all ages compared to the other Zelda games, and yet it is sold more than any other Zelda games, with many of those copies being to fairly young children. I'm sure you can all remember your first run through Breath of the Wild and how often you died. If a kid can get through the Great Plateau, then I firmly believe they can conquer this combat system. In conclusion, my system replaces or completely reworks the existing large monsters to make them more interesting and allow for more than one method to defeat them, to further encourage observation and adaptation, but most importantly, creative freedom in the true spirit of Breath of the Wild. It removes overpowered moves like the Flurry Rush to prevent one strategy from being too strong. It adds a second attack button and diversifies their uses, as well as intertwining their uses with combos to encourage creativity and diversity in move choice and allow for more strategies to be possible. It allows parries to be used as shield bashes to break enemy guards, which increases combat speed and gives the player more agency and options. It splits existing weapon categories and diversifies their functions and strategic uses, as well as splitting the weights of individual weapons in those categories to change the speeds at which they swing, to encourage adaptation and creativity with a diversified moveset. It adds reversal timings to swings that adjust damage based on how ideally the player can use their weapon, which tests the player's technique, reaction time, and adaptation to new weapons. It adds new enemy types as well as making existing ones more dynamic to further encourage observation and adaptation. It makes enemies more realistic and dynamic by making them learn from your fighting style to encourage creativity, discourage the adherence to strict patterns, and preserve difficulty later into the game. It reworks the damage calculation and healing method to prevent thoughtless approach to combat and to generally increase difficulty of combat encounters. It reduces the number of weapon slots, increases weapon durability, and reduces the number of weapons in the overworld to encourage the use of new, diversified weapon categories and reduce menu usage. Finally, it adds a crafting system that can allow players to create weapons with their collected materials to prevent players from ever being caught without the means to defend themselves, but is incorporated in a way to prevent it from being abusable or overpowered. Thank you very much for watching all the way through. I know this video is way longer than it has any right to be. If you have any other cool ideas that I didn't present, let us know in the comments as well. We'll all just have to add them to our lists of changes that we'd like to see. So once again, thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you in 4 years.